time to rock it from the Delta to the DMZ.
A scene from Good Morning Vietnam. Robin Williams as our guest, the real-life Adrian Cronauer. Adrian, back to the life and times of Robin Williams and your formulation of the motion picture, what became Good Morning Vietnam. How did this finally come to be made as a motion picture?
Well, it started off, JD, as a idea for a TV sitcom back in 1979. MASH was #1 in the ratings. WKRP in Cincinnati was very popular. And I figured if you put them together, you had Armed Forces Radio. So I did a treatment for a TV sitcom, and everybody in California said, well, you can't do a comedy about Vietnam. Oh, really? Why not? Well, it's war. There's nothing funny about war. Did you ever hear of McHale's Navy? Did you ever hear of Hogan's Heroes? Have you ever heard of MASH? Yeah, well, that was Korea and World War II. And your point is, well, this is Vietnam. There's nothing funny about that. Oh, really? Did you ever hear of McHale's Navy, Hogan's Heroes, MASH? So a couple of years later, still thinking in terms of television, I redid it as an idea for a movie of the week. And this time, friend's agent got it into Robin's hands, and he read it and said, oh, disc jockey, chance to do all my comics stick. Let's do it, only let's do it as a real movie. So he and his manager bought an option on it, and every year they'd renew it, and about 4 years later they'd call me up one day and said, well, we've decided to go into production, but we're going to throw away the original and start all over again. So I went out to California and spent a week there telling them everything I could remember happening in Vietnam, and they'd say things like, oh, that's a great incident. We'll have to choose that. We'll have to use that in the movie. Of course, we'll have to change it totally. And then it went through 5 generations of scripts. And eventually my wife and I are sitting in a screening room in California watching a rough cut and saying to ourselves, son of a gun, they actually made a movie out of this thing.
Now, granted, there always are going to be some changes between the initial creative concept and the final product. And obviously, you were not in charge of casting, but in retrospect, did Robin Williams acquit himself in a way that captured the essence of what you were doing on the radio there, on Armed Forces Radio in Vietnam during your time there?
Well, he was a little over the top. No, he was a lot over the top. And anybody who's been in television or been in broadcasting, as well as anybody who's been in the military, will tell you, if I'd done half that stuff, I'd still be in Leavenworth instead of Southwest Virginia. There's a lot of Hollywood exaggeration and outright imagination. But it was never intended to be an accurate point-by-point biography. It was intended to be a piece of entertainment. And he was nominated for an Academy Award. That's not too shabby, so I guess it was entertaining. And
an Academy Award portraying you. Now, yeah. you look back at this, Adrian Cronauer, and we were talking about it before the break. And you offered insight about seeing Robin Williams interact with his children.
Yes.
On this day, following the news of his passing, what is the most pointed or perhaps poignant recollection you have today of Robin Williams?
Well, that's a good question. I think probably the fact that he was always on. You'd walk up to him and say hello, and he'd start doing a routine for you. And the only time that we've ever seen him drop that down was when he was playing with his little kids. Because, you see, he's, like many comedians, a very insecure person. Why, I don't know, but comedians tend to be that way. And his kids give him unconditional love. They're no threat to him, you see.
And given that unconditional love, it's interesting because there is the paradox, having been involved in broadcasting and politics, always seeking approval, in my case, approval from the voters, and it sets up this kind of weird confidence and yet an insecurity. How was that? Was that okay? And you were saying just in terms of any personal interaction, if you will, by and large, Robin Williams, not in a pejorative way, but Robin would give you a performance during the course of what could be a social conversation.
Exactly, JD. And that kind of insecurity, I don't know where it comes from among the comedians, but they were talking on TV this morning about how Chevy Chase had been saying he felt so depressed on occasion. But I think that Robin, particularly, because he was so talented, because he was so effervescent and inventive, that with him it just carried over into his performances to the extent that he was always on.
There is much made of the parallels, and indeed he worked with Jonathan Winters there on Mork and Mindy, and the talk was they would go into the attic and they would just kind of riff, do improvisations for each other, picking up different kind of props. About a minute and a half left. Jonathan Winters of your generation, Robin Williams of mine, were there in fact real similarities between the two?
Oh, I think they were both fine improvisational comedians, but Robin Williams took what basic material that he was given and just went off with it in an entirely new and unexpected way. So when Jonathan Winters gave him the basic material, Robin took off with it.
And speaking of taking off with something, you mentioned how director Barry Levinson kept you and Robin Williams apart. But
Yes.
we heard it coming in before the break, and it is Robin Williams doing your signature salutation from Vietnam. So in honor and in memory of Robin Williams, Adrian Cronauer, will you give us that broadcast sign-on and sign-off, if you would, please?
Well, JD, I have to tell you, first of all, as a setup, that he did not do it correctly. He just did a rising inflection of good
Well,
morning,
you get it
Vietnam.
for us. We've got 40 seconds. Go.
Okay, and so when I was doing it, it was more a matter of survival, because you would always, if you're a morning man, eventually oversleep. And you come tearing into the station, you don't have anything upset, you don't know where your headphones are, and you go, good